My wife went out that night to meet her friends, as she did from time to time. I didn't suspect, I never suspected. I wasn't the kind of man who allowed himself to be carried away by unfounded jealousy or paranoid thoughts. But that night, something was different. I knew it, I felt it. When she returned home, the smell came before her. That perfume. It wasn't hers, and it wasn't mine. It was strong, striking, an unmistakable smell that hit me like a punch in the stomach before any words were even spoken. She walked through the door smiling, trying to look normal, as if nothing had happened. But everything about her screamed that something was wrong. His hair was a little disheveled, the different sparkle in his eyes, the way he avoided looking at me for a long time. She barely walked through the door and I already knew. And, at that moment, the only thing I could say was, I know this perfume. The sentence hung in the air, carrying a weight she hadn't expected. Her smile faltered, the muscles in her face twitching for a brief moment before she tried to regain her posture. But I had already seen it. She realized that I knew, and that was the kind of thing a cheating wife never wants to see in her husband's eyes. The naked truth that she was caught. I took a deep breath, trying to maintain control of my voice, my body, my hatred that was growing every second inside me like a storm about to destroy everything. I'm sure, I added. Her silence was all I needed for confirmation. She swallowed hard, hesitated, tried to look away, but I didn't let her. I approached slowly, observing every smallest detail of his face, his body, his gestures. Her hands were shaking slightly. She was nervous. Terrified. Not because she regretted it, but because she had been discovered. Because at that very moment, everything she thought was a secret was out in the open. Do you want to tell me where you've been? I asked, with a tone of voice that was too calm, threatening in its coldness. She blinked quickly, tried to find the right words, but the lie was already dead before it was born. I was with the girls, he said, forcing a smile. I laughed. A short, dry, acid laugh. She swallowed hard. With the girls? I repeated, crossing my arms. So are you going to tell me that one of your friends wears exactly the same perfume as him? Or are you going to try to convince me that you just bumped into someone on the street and that smell stuck with you? The color in her face drained. She knew that anything she said would only make the situation worse. Silence was his biggest mistake. You lied to me, I continued, my voice becoming increasingly harsh. You broke everything we built. Did you think you could go out, do whatever you wanted, then come home like nothing happened? Did you really think I'd never find out? Panic took over her. She tried to touch my hand, but I pulled away. Baby, please, you're overreacting. His voice was a whisper, but there was no sweetness in it anymore, only fear. She knew she had lost. The divorce came out of my mouth before I even thought twice. It's over, I said. And there, at that moment, something in her broke. Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't care. No more. No, wait, please. It was a mistake. It doesn't mean anything. His voice shook, his posture collapsed, and I just watched. It doesn't mean anything. I repeated, my voice filled with a coldness that I didn't even know I had. So you destroyed our family for something that means nothing? She tried to explain herself, she tried to make excuses, she tried to promise things she could never keep. But the only thing I could hear was my own breathing, heavy, deep, trying to contain an explosion of feelings that ranged from anger to disappointment, from sadness to fury. I loved her. I trusted her. I built a life alongside her. And she threw it all away for one night, for one illusion, for one moment that now became her biggest nightmare. But what she didn't know was that the worst was yet to come. Because that masculine perfume wasn't just any detail. It wasn't just an unfamiliar smell. It was a perfume I knew very well. A perfume that made me realize that this betrayal was much worse than I could have imagined. She didn't cheat on me with some stranger. She didn't destroy our marriage because of any mistake. She did something unforgivable. Something that would change everything forever. And now, she would have to deal with the consequences. Welcome to the channel. Here, betrayal will never be romanticized or justified. The stories you will hear are fictional, but they carry a cruel truth. Betrayal destroys lives, corrodes relationships, and leaves scars that not even time can erase. Our goal is to show how every choice has consequences and that disloyalty always takes its toll. Get ready for a shocking story, full of twists and unforgettable lessons. Now, let's get started. James has always been a reliable man, one of those who carry the weight of the world on his shoulders without complaining. From a young age, he learned that love and loyalty were the pillars of a solid marriage, and when he met Emily, he was sure he had found someone who shared the same values. They fell in love intensely, like two young people who believed in the eternity of feelings. The years passed and, with them, came the challenges of any long-term relationship. But James never had any doubts that they were building something strong, unshakable. He worked hard, spent hours dedicating himself to his own business, a small company that, with a lot of effort, he managed to expand. He always believed that his role was to provide security for Emily, to ensure that she lacked nothing, that she had comfort and happiness with him. And, most of the time, I believed I was succeeding. Emily was different from James in many ways. More extroverted, always surrounded by friends, she had a presence that effortlessly attracted attention. She knew how to make any room revolve around her, as if it carried magnetic energy. At first, James admired this trait. I liked seeing her so alive, so spontaneous. But over time, he began to notice that Emily never seemed to be satisfied. No matter how many trips they took together, how many romantic dinners he planned, there was always a void in his eyes, a restlessness that he couldn't fill. Emily wasn't unhappy, but she was restless. She wanted to feel desired, admired, she wanted the certainty that she still had the power to fascinate. Their marriage seemed solid to anyone looking in from the outside. They had a beautiful house, dinners with friends, well-planned trips, moments of affection and complicity. But for James, there was always that silent doubt, was it enough? He never expressed this concern out loud, perhaps because he was afraid of the answer. He knew Emily liked attention, and he always tried hard to keep her happy, but time seemed to work against him. The overwhelming passion of the early years had given way to a comfortable but predictable routine. And he, who saw this stability as a sign of maturity and growth in the relationship, didn't realize that Emily didn't see things the same way. Emily was not a cold woman. She liked James, she felt affection for him, but something inside her cried out for something more. She wanted to feel her heart racing, she wanted that sparkle in her eyes that she had at the beginning of the relationship, that anxiety before a date. But time erased these sensations, replacing them with a safe but monotonous stability. She tried to ignore this restlessness, she told herself that married life was like that all relationships went through phases, but this dissatisfaction consumed her in moments of silence, when she found herself alone with her own thoughts. The neighborhood where they lived was quiet, one where neighbors greeted each other and families organized barbecues on the weekends. James liked the predictability of it. He was a man who valued routine, who liked the idea of knowing what to expect the next day. For him, true love was about stability, trust, being there in difficult times and sharing the good ones. Emily, on the other hand, wanted something more unpredictable. She wanted to feel alive, and as much as she loved the security James provided, she couldn't shake the feeling that something inside her had been dormant for too long. They had a group of friends who met frequently. Dinners, weekend trips, parties organized at home. Emily was always the center of attention, with her easy smile, her way of telling stories and involving everyone around her. James was happy to see her like this, but at the same time, he knew that sparkle in her eyes wasn't for him. Emily loved parties, she loved feeling desired, she loved it when someone gave her an admiring look. For James, this was natural, part of her personality, and he never saw it as a problem. Until that moment. That particular night, Emily announced that she was going out with her friends. It was something he did every now and then, and James never questioned it. He trusted her. I knew she liked to have fun, but I also knew she always came home. He was used to these outings, seeing her get ready, choosing the perfect dress, perfuming herself with that familiar scent. But something was different that night. Emily seemed too excited. James noticed the sparkle in her eyes as she looked at her own reflection in the mirror, something he hadn't seen in a while. He came over, kissed her exposed shoulder and told her she looked beautiful. Emily smiled, but there was something distant in her eyes, something that made James feel a tightness in his chest that he couldn't explain. While she went out, he stayed at home, as always. He opened a bottle of wine, put on a movie to watch, but his mind wasn't there. He was trying to concentrate, but something was bothering him, a discomfort he couldn't name. Time passed slowly, and with each hour that passed, James felt an inexplicable anxiety growing within him. When he heard the door open, it was already past 2 in the morning. Emily entered quietly, taking off her shoes to keep from making noise. But James was already awake, sitting on the couch, waiting. It was then that he smelled it. It wasn't her perfume. It was another. Strong. Masculine. Family. And in that instant, everything changed. James remained sitting on the couch, his eyes fixed on Emily's figure as she tried to act like nothing was wrong. But everything was wrong. The smell of another man permeated her, the way he avoided his eyes, the rush to get rid of his shoes and clothes before even exchanging a word. He felt his stomach turn, a chill running down his spine that ran through his entire body. His mind was racing, but he forced himself to take a deep breath. If he said something right then, he might say something he would regret later. Emily forced a smile and said that the night was fun, that her friends were excited and that they ended up losing track of time. But James knew it was a lie. He watched her every gesture, every detail, the hesitation in her voice, the way her hands clasped nervously. He knew Emily like no one else. He knew when she was happy, when she was angry, when she was hiding something. And that night, she was hiding something. He stood up slowly, approaching her without looking away. Emily hesitated for a second, then forced a laugh and asked why he was so serious. James didn't respond. He just raised one of his hands and lightly grabbed the sleeve of her dress, getting close enough to smell her perfume up close. The smell was intense, strong, and didn't belong to him. His jaw clenched, his heart pounded in his chest, but he still didn't say anything. He wanted her to talk, he wanted to see how far she would go with that lie. Emily bit her lip, uncomfortable with the silence, and tried to change the subject. She asked if he had had dinner, if he wanted her to prepare something. A pathetic effort to divert your attention. James felt anger rising within him, a suffocating heat burning inside, but he maintained control. He took a step back, leaving space between them, crossed his arms and, in a colder tone than he intended, asked, "Where have you really been, Emily?" Her smile disappeared completely. For a moment, he looked like he was going to object, but he gave up halfway through. She knew he already suspected, and any excuse would be dismantled in seconds. Still, she tried to maintain her composure, claiming that she stayed with her friends late and that someone bumped into her at a bar, perhaps that was what he was feeling. James let out a dry, humorless laugh and shook his head. She was underestimating his intelligence, and that hurt almost as much as the betrayal he hadn't yet confirmed. The night dragged on in tense silence. Emily went to the bathroom, locked the door and took longer than necessary to shower. James stood in the same spot, not knowing whether to go into his room or just leave the house and drive aimlessly until he could think straight. But he wouldn't run away. Not this time. When Emily got out of the shower, already dressed for bed, she pretended nothing had happened. She lay down next to him on the bed and turned off the lights. James kept his eyes open, listening to her breathing, feeling the weight of everything that was happening. Couldn't sleep. His head was pounding with thoughts he didn't want to have. He needed the truth. The next day, James left for work early, but his mind wasn't there. He tried to concentrate on spreadsheets, meetings, emails, but it was impossible. Everything seemed meaningless given what was happening. He needed to know. And that's why he made the decision. He took out his cell phone and sent a message to one of Emily's friends, someone who had always had a cordial relationship with him, but who knew he wouldn't lie to cover anything up. The answer came quickly and was a punch in the gut. Emily. Yesterday. She didn't even go out with us. She cancelled at the last minute. The world seemed to spin. James' hands went cold, his eyes fixed on his cell phone screen as he read those words over and over again. He felt his chest tighten, his breath run out. There was no longer any doubt. Emily had lied to him. And if she wasn't with her friends, who was she with? He left work early, without even warning. He drove through the city without knowing exactly where to go. He thought about going home and confronting her right away, but something inside him told him he needed proof first. His instinct told him that this wasn't the first time, and that if he waited, he could discover a lot more. So he decided to observe. Over the next few days, James paid more attention to the small details. He noticed how Emily spent more time on her cell phone than usual, how she smiled to herself while typing messages, how she went out for appointments that she never mentioned before. Little by little, the pieces began to fall into place, and each discovery was more painful than the last. He felt anger rising, but with it came an overwhelming sadness. How did he not notice before? How could you be so blind? Confirmation came a few days later. Emily said she was going to the grocery store, but James knew it was a lie. He followed her. He kept his distance, watching her park the car, get out of the vehicle and walk quickly to a discreet cafe in the city center. James parked across the street and waited. He knew something would happen. And then, there he was. A man. Well-dressed, with a confident smile on his face. Emily greeted him with a hug that was too long, too intimate. They sat, talked as if they were alone in the world. James felt his stomach turn when he saw the way she touched his arm, the way she threw her hair back, the way she smiled in that way she hadn't smiled at him in a long time. I didn't need anything else. Betrayal was before his eyes. Irrefutable. Cruel. Real. James clenched his fists, took a deep breath, and knew that moment would change his life forever. He wouldn't act on impulse. Not at that moment. But that wouldn't go unpunished. He just needed to wait for the right moment. The perfect moment for Emily to understand exactly what she had done. The moment when everything she hid would come to light, and she would pay the price. And that moment was coming. James didn't sleep that night. The weight of betrayal crushed his chest like an unmovable rock. He felt every muscle in his body tense, every beat of his heart marked by hatred, pain, humiliation. The scene at the cafe never left her head, the touch of hands, the easy smile, the way Emily looked at that man as if she were in love. He got up from the bed without making a sound, not wanting to wake her. He felt a wave of disgust when he saw her sleeping peacefully next to him, as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't destroyed their marriage. The air inside the room felt thick, heavy. He needed space, he needed to think, he needed to understand how he would do this. He didn't just want to confront her. He wanted her to feel what he felt. The next morning, Emily acted as if nothing was wrong. She kissed him mechanically, as she did every morning, and continued with her routine without suspecting anything. James watched her every move, analyzing every expression, every gesture. He wanted to find some sign of regret, some hint that maybe she felt guilty. But he found nothing. His stomach dropped. She didn't even seem bothered. That infuriated him even more. He spent the day collecting everything he needed. Bank records, deleted messages recovered on the cell phone, connection histories. His lover's name appeared more times than he would have liked. He was a close person. Too close. And that made James' blood run cold. The perfume you smelled on her that night. He knew why it looked so familiar. It wasn't just any perfume. He recognized him because he had been close to him many times, because he had shaken that man's hand, because he had laughed with him at dinner, because he trusted him. Emily's lover was someone he knew. And that changed everything. His stomach turned when he realized that the betrayal went beyond what he imagined. It wasn't just a case. It wasn't just an unimportant adventure. Emily had cheated on him with someone who was part of their lives, someone who had always been there, someone he considered a friend. He felt like an idiot. All this time, while he was dedicating himself to his marriage, while he was trying to keep things going, while he was worrying about Emily and her happiness, she was lying in another man's bed. A man he respected. Night fell, and James knew this was the moment. He prepared everything. He wanted it to be unforgettable for her. When Emily arrived, she found the house strangely silent. The lights were off, only a lamp in the corner of the room left the room bathed in yellowish light, creating elongated shadows across the walls. James was sitting on the couch, calm, collected. Emily stood in the doorway, hesitant, feeling something was out of place. He asked her to sit down. His voice was cold, cutting. She hesitated, but approached slowly. James watched her for a long moment before finally opening his mouth. He asked her if she was happy, if she liked the life they had, if she felt like he did enough for her. Emily was taken aback. He tried to laugh, tried to divert the conversation to something lighter, but James didn't look away. He placed the phone on the table and swiped the screen. Photos appeared. She saw her own reflection in one of them, sitting at the breakfast table, smiling in a way she hadn't smiled at James in a long time. She froze. The blood drained from his face. The silence became unbearable. Emily opened her mouth, but no words came out. James continued. He said he followed her. He said he knew. He said he saw everything. Her body stiffened. She tried to deny it, tried to come up with some pathetic excuse, but he wouldn't let her. He threw away the call logs, the recovered messages, the bank statements showing hotel reservations. She swallowed hard, eyes wide, panic evident. But nothing would prepare her for what he said next. James said the name of the man she was with. The lover's name. The name of someone who should be untouchable for both of them. Emily collapsed. She covered her mouth with her hands, her eyes full of despair, her breathing uneven. She didn't expect him to find out. I didn't expect him to know who he was. James saw the horror on her face and felt a sick satisfaction. He wanted her to suffer, wanted her to feel the same crushing pain he felt. Emily tried to deny it, tried to find a way out, tried to beg him to listen to her, but James stood up, moving away from her as if the simple contact was something repulsive. He wanted to understand. I wanted to hear from her. Why? Why someone so close? Why someone he trusted? She cried. She collapsed there, in the middle of the room, unable to face him. But James didn't want tears. He wanted the truth. And finally she said. She cheated on him with the man James respected most. With someone who should be unattainable. With someone who was part of the family. The betrayal was greater than he imagined. It was something that corroded everything. And there, in that moment, James knew that nothing could be forgiven. Nothing could be forgotten. The only thing left was the destruction of everything they had built. James felt his chest on fire, a suffocating weight inside him, as if each breath was a superhuman effort. Emily stood before him, shattered, her eyes teary, her mouth opening and closing in futile attempts to form words. He saw the desperation in her, saw the guilt written on her face, but he didn't feel sorry. There was no more room for compassion. The betrayal was already a cruel blow, but the fact that it was with that specific person made it even worse. He stared at her, waiting for her to say something that would at least make it understandable, but every second that passed in silence only increased his contempt. He didn't just want answers. I wanted to see her sink under the weight of her own choices. How could you do this to me? James broke the silence, his voice serious and low, filled with a cold fury, much worse than a scream. Emily trembled, shrinking into the couch as if she wanted to disappear. James. I don't know what to say. Her voice was a whisper, a shaky thread of sound that didn't convince anyone. He laughed, a bitter, dry laugh, without a trace of humor. He walked slowly around the room, rubbing his hands over his face as if trying to get rid of the absurd tension that was taking over his body. Don't know what to say. He repeated, mockingly, turning to her. Funny. I know exactly what to say. I know you destroyed everything. I know you lied, looked me in the eyes and pretended you loved me while you slept with him. I know you've been making a fool of me this whole time. Emily sobbed, covering her face with her hands. I never wanted to hurt you, but it hurt. James interrupted her, having no patience for false justifications. And the worst? You did this to someone who was supposed to be. He shook his head, unable to complete the sentence. Emily looked up, desperate, her eyes begging for something he wasn't willing to give. It was a mistake. James clenched his fists, feeling the blood boil in his veins. No. A mistake is forgetting a birthday. A mistake is saying something without thinking. What you did wasn't a mistake, Emily. It was a choice. She cried even more, but he didn't care. How many times? The question came out like thunder in the silence, and Emily froze. How many times? He repeated, slowly, each word like a sharp knife. She hesitated, her eyes moving around the room as if looking for a way out, a way to escape that question. I need to know, James pressed, taking a step forward. Emily whispered, closing her eyes as if that could prevent the impact of her response. He gave a humorless laugh. As if it were something banal. As if it didn't matter. Emily opened her mouth, but no words came out. James pulled away, taking a deep breath. The room seemed too small, too suffocating. I needed to get out of there before I lost control for good. He picked up the car keys from the table, walking to the door. Where are you going? Emily asked, her voice breaking. He stopped for a second, without turning around. Away from you. And left. The night was cold when James got into the car, his hands gripping the steering wheel hard enough to turn his knuckles white. He didn't know where to go. I just knew I couldn't stay there. I couldn't look at Emily without feeling the bitter taste of betrayal in her mouth. He drove aimlessly for hours, crossing empty streets, feeling the silence weigh even more heavily on his shoulders. His mind was spinning non-stop, reliving every moment, every detail, every fake smile Emily gave him while sleeping with another man. But the worst part wasn't the betrayal itself. That's who was involved. It was someone who was part of his life in a profound way, someone he could never imagine as a threat. A friend. A man James respected. He felt the taste of bile rising in his throat. Anger rose within him like an uncontrolled beast. His cell phone vibrated on the dashboard. Emily. He ignored it. It vibrated again. This time, a message. He didn't want to read it, but something inside him forced him to. He picked up the device and slid the screen, his eyes fixed on the illuminated screen. James, please come home. We need to talk. I can explain. He laughed. Explain? What could be explained? What could justify the fact that she cheated on her husband with a man James considered a brother? His stomach dropped, and he gripped his cell phone so hard his fingers hurt. I wouldn't go home. Not yet. He just kept driving, his heart heavy, his mind full of questions that would never have satisfactory answers. When it finally stopped, it was already dawn. He found himself standing in front of a hotel, one of those small, inconspicuous ones, the kind of place someone would use to hide out. The thought made his skin crawl. By any chance, was that where they were going? Was this the kind of place where Emily lay with him? He closed his eyes, trying to erase the images that appeared in his mind. But he couldn't. Betrayal was embedded inside him like a sharp blade, and nothing would remove it. But one thing was certain. It wouldn't end like this. James remained still inside the car, the headlights off, his fingers clenched against the steering wheel. The hotel in front of him seemed harmless to anyone passing by on the street, but to him, that place represented something much bigger. There, hidden behind anonymous walls, was the dirty truth of everything Emily had done. It wasn't just any hotel. It was where she went, where she gave herself, where she laughed, where she whispered words that belonged to him to another man. The thought gnawed at his chest like acid, every imagined detail fueling a growing hatred. He didn't know how long he stayed there, staring at the building's entrance, his mind oscillating between the desire to go in and confront that dirty past or simply leave and pretend he never knew. But pretending was not an option. It would never be again. The clock read almost 3 in the morning when he finally started the engine again. I wouldn't go home. At least not yet. He drove away, aimlessly, just letting the road unfold before him as his mind spun, caught up in the latest events. Emily had called 7 times, sent countless messages. He didn't answer any. Her voice was the last thing he wanted to hear right now. There was no excuse, there was no justification, there were no words that could change the fact that everything he knew to be true was now a lie. He had lost something that could never be recovered. Dawn turned the sky orange when he finally returned home. The door was unlocked, as if Emily had been waiting for him. The familiar smell of morning coffee wafted through the air, a pathetic attempt at normalcy. When he entered the room, she was there, sitting on the couch, her eyes swollen and red, holding the phone between her trembling fingers. When she saw him, she jumped to her feet, as if afraid he would disappear again. She opened her mouth to speak, but he raised his hand, silencing her before any words could come out. He didn't want to hear an apology. I didn't want an apology. I wanted the truth. Do you love him? The question cut through the air like a blade, and Emily hesitated, tears pooling in her eyes. James, I asked if you love him. Yes or no? She swallowed hard, looked down, her fingers twisting the hem of her shirt as if that could save her from the pain of the answer. I don't know. James laughed, a dry, incredulous laugh. Don't you know? So you destroyed all this for an I don't know? She shook her head desperately, the tears now running free. I didn't plan this. I didn't want that to happen. He ran a hand over his face, trying to control the storm inside him. But it happened. And now? What do you want? Emily was silent. For a moment, only the sound of her ragged breathing filled the room. I want to fix this. James felt his chest tighten. To repair. Do you really think this can be fixed? She advanced towards him, tried to touch his hand, but he moved away. I don't want to lose you, James. I can't lose you. He stared at her for a long time, as if trying to see inside her, beyond the betrayal, beyond the tears, beyond the despair. But all I saw was a woman who had made a conscious decision and was now dealing with the consequences. You've already lost me. The words were a whisper, but they hit Emily with the force of a blow. She fell onto the couch, covering her face, her body shaking with sobs. James stayed there for a few more seconds, feeling the weight of goodbye settle between them. Then, without looking back, he went up the stairs to his room, picked up a suitcase and began filling it with his clothes. Emily didn't try to stop him. He knew this needed to end. But what would come next? He had no answer for that. But something inside him said that his story wasn't completely written yet. And that the ending would still surprise him. James closed the suitcase with a single dry movement, the zipper sliding from one side to the other as if it were the end point of something that took years to build and just days to fall apart. Each piece of clothing he placed there represented a piece of his life that he was leaving behind. He felt his fingers tremble slightly as he held the handle, but he didn't hesitate. I knew I couldn't stay there. The air inside that house was toxic, suffocating, filled with memories that were now tarnished. Emily was sitting on the edge of the bed, her eyes still red, her hands spread across her legs, as if she was trying to hold on to something. She looked at him as he walked through the door, but said nothing. There was nothing more to say. He crossed the hall without looking back. When he went downstairs, the silence in the house seemed shocking. He used to love that place. Every corner of the room, every hand-picked piece of furniture, every painting hanging on the walls told a story. Now everything seemed distant, unrecognizable. He headed for the door, but before he could turn the handle, he heard footsteps behind him. Emily was there, standing a few meters away from him, her face tired, her skin pale, her eyes sunken. Are you really leaving? Her voice was almost a whisper, filled with something he couldn't decipher. He lay on his back for a moment, feeling the weight of that question on his shoulders. Then, slowly, he turned to face her. What did you expect? For me to stay? For us to pretend nothing happened? She closed her eyes tightly, as if trying to contain the pain her words caused. I was hoping that maybe there was a way to. James let out a bitter laugh. A way of what, Emily? A way to fix what you destroyed? She shuddered. He saw the guilt brimming over every line of her face, but he felt no satisfaction. What did it matter if she was suffering now? Did that change anything? Did it erase everything she did? She approached, hesitantly, as if stepping on broken glass. I know that nothing I say will change what happened. I know I made a mistake. But I didn't want it to be like that. He narrowed his eyes. So how did you want it to be, Emily? Did you want to keep lying? Continue living two lives? Did you want me to never find out? She was silent, and that was answer enough. James felt a lump form in his throat. You've already lost me. You know that, don't you? She nodded slowly, tears streaming down her face again. He took a deep breath, tightened the suitcase handle and finally opened the door. The cold morning light hit his face, as if the world outside was a completely different universe from the one he was leaving behind. He crossed the threshold without hesitation, feeling a weight lift off his back the moment he took the first step out of that house. But before he could move on, he heard her voice once again. James. He stopped, but didn't turn around. I loved you. For an instant, everything inside him froze. But then he remembered. She remembered the smell of male perfume permeated on her. He remembered the cafe where he saw her laughing, flirting, touching another man. Remembered the lies. Of the nights he slept next to her without knowing that she was no longer his. So, without looking back, he moved on. He drove aimlessly, the silence in the car becoming almost deafening. Every kilometer I left behind was a memory that receded, but no pain ever completely disappeared. He wondered if that feeling would ever pass, if he would ever wake up and no longer feel the bitter taste of betrayal in his mouth. It was only when he stopped in front of a familiar building that he realized where his subconscious had taken him. The apartment of an old friend, someone who has always been by your side in the most difficult times. He climbed the steps slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. When the door opened, he saw a familiar face, someone who looked at him with a mixture of surprise and concern. James. What happened? He didn't respond right away. He just dropped his suitcase on the floor and ran his hands over his face, feeling exhaustion finally hitting him. He finished. His friend studied him for a moment before opening the door wider. "Come in. Let's talk." James walked in, feeling the weight of the world on his shoulders. I knew that night wouldn't be easy. I knew the next few weeks would be even worse. But at least, at that moment, he didn't have to face everything alone. And maybe, just maybe, it would be the first step towards something new. Something that I still couldn't see, but that, somehow, was already beginning to appear on the horizon. James didn't come home that night, nor the next night. In fact, he would never return. He spent the first few days like a ghost, wandering aimlessly, not knowing exactly how to rebuild a life that had been destroyed from the inside out. In the silence of the apartment of the friend who welcomed him, he reflected on everything. About how he spent years believing he was building something solid, without realizing that the foundation had been crumbling for some time. About how he trusted, about how he loved, about how he was betrayed by someone who was supposed to be his life partner. But, mainly, about how he wouldn't allow this betrayal to define who he was. The divorce paperwork arrived for Emily faster than she imagined. She knew James wouldn't forgive her, but she never thought he would be so ruthless. No fights, no arguments, no elaborate goodbyes. Just cold, objective documents, accompanied by a short note. "You made your choice. Here's mine." It was at that moment that Emily realized the depth of the damage. Not only did she lose her husband, but she lost his respect. There was no more room for justifications, for tears, for any attempt to patch up what was beyond repair. She tried to continue her life, but nothing was the same. Her friends, who had once admired her for her charisma and energy, now regarded her with silent judgment. The lover, who promised everything would be fine, began to walk away. He never wanted commitment, he never wanted to take it further. Now that James knew, now that everything had exploded, he didn't want to be involved in the ashes of what was left. Emily found herself alone. I stared at the phone waiting for a call that would never come. I waited for a forgiveness that would never come. The emptiness around him was overwhelming. I walked through the rooms of the house that was once a home and realized that, even before the betrayal, I was already lost. Only now did he understand that by seeking something new and exciting, he destroyed everything that truly mattered. James, on the other hand, began to rebuild his life. It wasn't easy. Every day was an effort, every morning was a struggle not to look back. But he clung to one thought: the future was his. He refused to let the pain consume him, refused to let Emily have power over his happiness. He found refuge in work, dedicated himself more to himself, to the little things he had left aside over the years. And then, it happened. Met someone. Not in a cliché way, not as a distraction to ease the pain. But in an unexpected and natural way. A woman who wasn't trying to fill him, but who just showed up, without pressure, without comparisons, without the weight of the past. He was hesitant at first, reluctant to allow anything new into his life, but he gradually realized that love didn't die because of betrayal. Emily, on the other hand, faced loneliness cruelly. The lover went on with his life as if nothing had happened, leaving her with the weight of her own choices. No James, no support, no one to blame but herself. She wanted to go back in time, she wanted to make different choices, she wanted to rewrite the past, but all she had left was regret. And regret doesn't bring anyone back. James looked at all this from afar, without resentment, without desire for revenge. Only with the certainty that I had done the only thing I could do: move forward. Emily reaped what she sowed. He, on the other hand, chose to rebuild. Cheating destroyed a marriage, but it didn't destroy your life. He won. Not because he hurt Emily back, but because he chose to be greater than the pain she caused. Now, I want to hear from you. What did you think of this story? Comment below your opinion, share your thoughts. And if you haven't subscribed yet, take the opportunity to do so now so you don't miss any stories like this. Remember, this channel will never support any type of betrayal. Until next time.